I'm Said and I'm going to present on the introduction for the textual analysis.
Today I will be presenting on the direct translation found in the book.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the analysis of the oblique translation.
I will be presenting on the review part of the translation.
Today, I will be presenting on the conclusions of the analysis.
For the textual analysis, we have choose one novel from Francis Fukuyama, which is The End of History and the Last Man. This book has been translated into Bahasa Melayu, which is Penamat Sejarah dan Manusia Terakhir. So, who is the translator for this book? So, this novel was translated by ITBM, which stands for Institute Terjemahan dan Buku Malaysia, or in English, they are known as Malaysian Institute of Translation and Book. So, ITBM is a prominent figure in translating books. So far, they have been translated many books into Malay language. So, they are one of the organizations that plays an important role in translating English book into Malay book. Therefore, they are not just translating English to Malay, but from other languages into Bahasa Melayu. So, they are one of the prominent figure in translating book in Malaysia. So moving on to the synopsis of this novel, we have been divided into 4 parts, which are the first one is politics, society, culture, and individual. For the politics, it argues about the rise of Western society, which is the liberal democracy after the year of 1941 to 1991 during the era of Cold War and Soviet Union. For the society, there are many philosophies and ideologies introduced by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Karl Marx, in which both of them defined human society as a linear progression. Moving on next to the culture, which one is discussed on the notion of the history as a process of evaluation from the primitive to the liberal capital democracy. The last one is the individual part. In this part, Fukuyama himself, the writer for this book, sees the post-Cold War as one of the victory of the capitalism and social democracy, which leads to the end of the history. The reason why we choose this novel because of 2 things. The first one, we want to see how a translator use the techniques or the style in translating a history book. Thus, it's different from other kind of book. Next is we want to educate the youth about the importance of history. In this case, we want to educate the youth on the history of Cold War and Soviet Union.
Okay, now let's move into the technique used by translator when translating the book. There are 2 techniques which are direct translation and oblique translation. I will be covering on the direct translation. Direct translation is basically the most common technique used by translator when translating a book or documents. So under direct translation, there are 3 techniques which are borrowing, cult, and literal translation. Now, let's look into what is borrowing. Borrowing is basically when you translate the word from the source language directly into the target language without major changes being made to the word. For example, borrowing also being known as loan words. So from the book itself, we can see, for example, the word optimistic in the English version is being translated into the Malay version as optimistic. The only changes that happen to the word is the alphabet C is being replaced by alphabet K in Malay version as to meet the requirement for the target language. Okay, the next technique is called cult technique. Cult technique is basically when a phrase from the source language is being translated into the target language word for word. It is also known as loan translation. Under the cult technique, there are 2 types of cult, which are lexical cult and structural cult. But for this book, the translator only incorporated one type of cult, which is the lexical cult. Lexical is when you translate a phrase into the target language, but you still respect the structure of a sentence from the target language. For example, a phrase in the English version from the book, a totalitarian government, is being translated into the Malay version as kerajaan totalitarian. The word totalitarian is remained, but the government is being translated as kerajaan, and it still respect the structure of sentence of the target language, in which it changed from the government appear after the totalitarian, but in Malay version, kerajaan appear in the front of the phrase. Okay, now let's look into the last technique under direct translation, which is literal translation. Literal translation is basically when a word is being translated from source language into the target language without changing the meaning and without looking into whether the word fit the phrase or the sentence itself. It is also commonly known as word-by-word translation. In layman words, it means that the sentence is being translated into the target language according to the word. For example, from the book, in the English version, the sentence is the father of the modern notion of social or politician progress, but the sentence is being translated into the Malay version as bapa tanggapan moden bagi kemajuan sosial atau politik. It means that the word in the sentence is being translated directly word by word. The father is being translated into bapa, and then modern notion is being translated as tanggapan moden. Okay, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to explain about oblique translation in this novel. So oblique translation is used whenever there are words or phrases that cannot be directly translated without changing the meaning. So there are several techniques under oblique, which are first, transposition, modulation, reformulation or equivalence, adaptation, and compensation. Okay, there are 5 subsections in this novel for oblique translation. So let's see the first example for subsection 1. There are 2 techniques used under this subsection 1. First is transposition. Transposition is where a word from one grammatical word class is replaced with another without changing the meaning of the message. Okay, so for example, in this book, blind obedience, when we translate it to Malay, it becomes membabi buta. Okay, so the literal translation for blind is buta. So it doesn't make sense if we want to translate it word per word. Okay, that means if we want to translate it word per word, it will give you a weird meaning, right? So that's why we applied transposition, so that the meaning of the translation will be more make sense. Okay, next is equivalence. For example, a few yards of devastated territory. So after we translate it, it becomes padan jarak, padan terkukur. So if it is translated directly, it will give us not a suitable meaning for that translation. So that's why we need to be more creative in translating the word. So when equivalence is applied, it becomes more sense and more relatable with the source language. Okay, for subsection 2, there are 2 techniques used, which are transposition and equivalence. Okay, it's the same technique used for subsection 1. So for example, for transposition, for example, civil war, when we translate it, it becomes perang saudara. So word class in sentence of civil war did not change the meaning. Okay, so the only thing that changed is the word class in the sentence structure, not the meaning. Okay, next is equivalent. For example, black sheep, when we translate it into Malay, it becomes kambing hitam. So, kambing hitam, which is suit with the Malaysian context, which carries the meaning of a member of a family or group who is regarded as a disgrace to it. So it's suitable with the source language. Next, for subsection 3, there are two techniques used, which are amplification and adaptation. So what is amplification? Amplification is a technique where details that are not formulated in source language are introduced or added in a target language for a better illustration. That means the details that are not in source language are introduced or be added in the target language to make the illustration become better. Okay, so for example is despotism. Despotism, when we translate it into Malay, it becomes sistem pemerintahan kuku besi. So in Malay, kuku besi is kuku besi brings the meaning of violence or oppressive manner. So it gives a better view or perspective to understand, for people to understand the intended meaning. Yes. Okay, so that one we call it as adaptation. We adapt. No, amplification. That means we amplificate the word. Okay. Next is adaptation. Okay, adaptation. For example, Polish people. Polish people, when we translate it, it become rakyat Poland. So we don't translate it as rakyat Polish. So it doesn't make sense, right? So that's why we need to customize. We customize the word according to its relevance. Okay, that means we don't directly translate it from Polish people to rakyat Polish. So because Polish is used to address people who belong to Poland nationality. Okay. Okay. Next is for subsection 4. There is one technique used, which is equivalence. For example, a given way, when we translate it, it becomes mengalah. Okay, so equivalence is it means that given way is the equivalence for the word mengalah. Given way, mengalah. Okay. Okay, last but not least is subsection 5, which is the last subsection in this analysis. There is one technique used here, which is transposition. So, for example, the germ of enlightenment, when we translate it, it becomes bibit kesedaran. So from here, we could see the changes in the structure of words in sentence, but not the meaning. So we can see the changes, a little bit changes in the structure, but the meaning is still the same. Okay, that means it still gives the same meaning. From the source language to the target language, the meaning is still the same. It's just the changes of the sentence structure.
For the review part of the novel translation, the most used technique of translation is direct translation. The reason could be because of how easier and direct it is for the technique to be employed in the translation process. The translation process under direct translation is also requires less effort, and the most used method under this technique is the borrowing method, where you can just take a word from your source language and then produce it similarly to your target translated text. And the least used technique for this novel is oblique translation. This could be because of how oblique translation, it requires more finesse in writing. If you are not a good writer, or if you don't have some sort of flair in writing, your translation could sound or could look forced. Other than that, oblique translation also requires more creative process, and with that it also requires time for a word to be produced or for a word to be translated properly. And last but not least, for oblique translation, when doing that, you have to mentally go through your vocabulary bank in order to find the right words for you to translate another word. That is all for the review part. Thank you.
Okay, so for the conclusion, this novel is well translated where it incorporates both techniques, which are the direct and also oblique techniques, and the techniques used are very sensible and equivalent between the source text and the target text, as we can see that the word choices make sense and relate to each other, and it still conveys the intended meaning. Even though the direct translation is mostly used in this novel, but literal translation is the least applied since it is highly potential to mislead the intended meaning. So here we can say that the translator are trying their best to use the most suitable techniques in order to translate the novel in a better way. And as for the future improvement, in our opinion, the translator, among the group of the translator, they should include one of the native speakers of the source language as a part of them. It is very important to include one of the native speakers of source language as a part of the translator teams, because they might have more perspective and more experience on how each words are functions and are used in different contexts. And also, as the translators, they need to have the prior knowledge on the society from both target language and also source language. For example, like they are familiar with the history and also traditions from both languages. And last but not least, the translator also need to put cultural aspect as the consideration while translating, because it can help them to translate the text in a better way and equivalence between the source text and the target text. And they can also make sure that the text translated can avoid any misleading information and do not touch any sensitive issue regarding the target languages and also source languages, and is very important so that the message could reach the audience effectively.
To wrap up, throughout this textual analysis, we have seen all the objectives that we mentioned earlier have been achieved. Well, it is interesting to translate historical materials because during the translation process itself, we can learn new jargon, new words, new terms regarding the historical, and we can compare those words, those jargon into our languages. Last but not least, we are looking forward to analyze more in the future, especially in the history book or any other field. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you and bye. Thank you, madam.